Hey everyone, welcome to my crash course on critical reasoning assumptions. Now, assumptions is one of those most important question types in GMAT critical reasoning. I'm sure if you're here, you're aware of it. It's so important that it ties into so many other question types. Think of strength and weaken, all of that. Today is all about assumptions. For some of you who are in their early stages of prep, this session is going to be your crash course for everything you need to know about assumptions. All the concepts, all the fundamental theories that you should know, and of course, how to solve those questions, how to apply the negation test effectively, many things coming right up. I hope this session is very useful for you. Good to see all of you. Much needed session. I absolutely believe so. I don't know how many of you were there for my previous session. That's inferences. Do check it out as well if that's an area you're struggling with. Today is about one of the most important things, that is assumption. So let's talk about what we are here to achieve today. I'm going to help you get better at CR assumption questions. And that's very broad, but specifically what are we going to cover today? All the fundamentals you need. And I really mean everything. From a concept and theory perspective, everything that you need as far as assumptions and arguments is concerned, this session is going to give it to you. The rest, you can go and practice tons and review and do proper error logging. You should see a lot of improvement. I'm going to teach you my framework to solve some of these questions, and I'm sure some of you will find some benefit from it. I'm going to discuss certain processes, think about negation test, which I think is one of the most important things that you will do in today's session and in assumptions in general. And of course, along the way, certain generally good principles from my experience, some types, themes, trap choices. We'll cover some aspects of all that. I hope you guys are excited. Right. This is just a sneak peek into the things that I plan to cover. Anything that I don't cover is probably going to be homework for you. I will be sharing the PDF with you. So it looks like a lot. So let's get cracking. Right. First things first, let's start with the absolute basics. What is an argument? And the first thing I want you to do is think real life. Argument doesn't mean fight. Argument is a central claim plus some reasoning, some sort of reasoning used to justify that central claim. Imagine you're in a boardroom and there are all these people who you want to convince of something. You have an idea. Hey, I deserve to be promoted because of so and so reasons. Or hey, let's run this particular marketing campaign, and here is why. Every time you do that, what you're presenting is an argument. You're presenting a claim, something you want the rest of the table to believe in, but it's only a claim unless you justify it. You present a claim, which we call in GMAT parlance as the conclusion here. Why is it a conclusion? Because it is being justified by some kind of reasoning, right? So here's a quick example of an assumption, right? And I wanted to put a real office kind of scenario because all of you are office goers, or you will be sitting in corporate offices. It is 6 p.m. Jack is not at his workplace, therefore he must have left office. The central claim, what I want you to believe in, me being the person who's making this argument, he must have left office. And what am I using to justify that stand? It is 6 p.m. That guy is not at his work desk, right? I hope what is an argument is crystal clear. Now, the first point of differentiation, which you should be very clear about if you're going to solve these questions on the exam, is argument versus passage. Because on the GMAT, you get both. Sometimes you get arguments, sometimes you get passages. The fundamental difference is a passage is just a set of statements, whereas an argument has the central claim that I'm talking about. So the example that we just saw, clearly an argument, because me being the author, I'm making this claim that yes, he must have left office. And then I'm justifying it using some reasoning. Look at what's there on the right. It is 6 p.m. Jack is not at his work desk. Jack typically leaves office at 6 p.m. I'm painting the story that he may have left office, but I haven't stated it yet. I haven't made that central claim at this point, right? So argument has that central claim, which we like to call the main conclusion. Passage does not have that. And if ever you're confused in a question, this is one of the things that you need to look for. What are you dealing with? I hope this is clear. Let's move to the next. Here's your first exercise of the day. I've given you 3 different stimuli, for want of a better word. Just tell me which of this is a passage, which of this is an argument, and then we'll get cracking. Zoe, you have done 50 questions of assumption in 2 days. That's quite a lot. I hope you feel much more confident with it now, but I'm sure Irrespective of where you are in your journey, whether you're a beginner or if you're a beginner, you'll learn a lot from this. If you're fairly advanced in your preparation, then also this would be very good revision. Good to see you here. So tell me, guys, just tell me which one is a passage, which wasn't one is an argument. Among 1, 2, and 3. Yeah. Good to see some responses coming in. 2 and 3 argument, PAA. All right. I think this is very, very clear. The first is a passage, the second and third are arguments. But why did I present both? We'll come to it in a second. And that's it's a segue into the next important concept here. First, for now, let's ignore those two on the left. Let's kind of focus on this. The question I have for you is, judge this argument. My job is to let you evaluate the argument. Tell me, is it a good argument or not? What is missing? Is something missing? Is there a problem in the argument? Is there an issue? Let me know. Anything that strikes. So it's a bad argument, not enough support or premise. Excellent. I'm looking for answers like that. Muskan, you're also right. It's not linked. Why is Ray Holt a better detective than Charles? That link between Jake and Charles is missing, right? There has to be some linkage between Jake and Charles to kind of conclude that Holt is a better detective than Charles, just based on Holt being a better detective than Jake, right? So, yeah, it's assuming that J is better than C. Yeah, we'll come to that, which may not be the case. We'll come to that, Sagnik. That's a very important point that you're bringing up. So we don't know that relationship, right? There's something missing. Now, even in the exam and in real life, when arguments are presented to you, you should be doing this. You are doing a critical analysis of the argument, trying to figure out, is this a sound argument? Will I believe this guy when he makes this presentation to me, when he presents this argument to me? Or is there something wrong? This is something you're meant to do in real life, even without answer choices. That's why we're not focusing on choices yet, right? So all of you got this. There is clearly a logical issue here, right? Just because Holt is a better detective than Jake, how can I just go on to conclude that Holt is a better detective than Charles? What is that connectivity between Jake and Charles? Something is missing, right? For instance, imagine this scenario. What if Jake is actually a worse detective than Charles? Then this argument wouldn't make much sense, right? Think about that. Now, why am I making you go through this? Because you have to understand what arguments on the GMAT look like. The second argument, everybody, all of you were right when you said that this is also an argument. Of course, 2 and 3 are arguments. But on GMAT, with regard to question types like assumption, strengthen, weaken, and evaluate, you're not going to get these types of arguments. And the reason for that is very simple. If you look at this argument, if I give you as a fact that Ray Holt is a better detective than Jake, and then I also give you the fact that Jake is a better detective than Charles, then this conclusion is bulletproof. You cannot question me. You may want to question me on it, but you can't, because I just presented to you a very, very ironclad argument. No bullet holes, no logic gaps, nothing. You wouldn't be able to question me. Now, if there is no bullet hole in the argument, if the argument is so strong, you don't have to assume anything to make it work, which is why you will never get this in an assumption question. The argument is so wonderful, so beautiful, everything is so solid, you don't need to assume anything. Similarly, the argument is so bulletproof, what flaw can you find? You won't find a way to weaken the argument because it's such a strong argument, right? So I hope you see the final point here. On the GMAT, what we call as GMAT style arguments, what you expect with assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate, flaw, are arguments where you will have some kind of a logic flaw, right? Something that can question the claim that's being made. I hope this is clear. I'm moving on. Let me know if there are any doubts here, right? I will be checking the chat periodically, guys. So I hope to cover all your doubts. If there's something missing, I'll circle back to it. Just make sure I put it in the comments or something. Right. So with that, let's continue with this small bit of theory. Bear with me. The explicit or given parts of an argument, right? So you would have heard all these terms, but let's be clear about what they mean. So every argument has two fundamental portions to it. One is the central claim, the grand conclusion, the main conclusion, the final point the author wants to convince us of. Author being whoever has written the argument, right? So in this case, in our argument, I'm using the same argument so that it's we don't have to repeat the work. So Rayhold is a better detective than Charles is a conclusion that I'm making, me being the author. Now, the word premise, and again, think real life. A premise is a setup, right? I'm setting up of certain premises. Think about it as a setup. The setup to justify that conclusion. So some of that setup is purely context. So if I give you a statement like this, hey, the NYPD, the 99th precinct of NYPD, many good detectives, Rayhold, Jake, Charles, all among them. Great. That's good context. Then you have something which is a direct basis, direct support for the conclusion. What is it that I used to make the conclusion that Rayhold is a better detective? The fact that Rayhold is a better detective than Jake, right? So some certain things are premises, certain things are conclusions. These are what you would find explicitly given in your typical CR argument. With me so far? So let me just take a second. I have a question. I'm giving CAT in MAT and ZAT this year. All the best. CAT deadlines are here. I presume it's in this month, right? In MAT and ZAT. Also planning to give. Is March a good time to give? GMAT, there's no such rule. It's a good time to give when you are ready. It does cost a ton of money, so make sure you write the exam when you're reasonably well prepared. That's the only thing. But otherwise, take it year round. Absolutely go crazy. It's a great exam. It's one of the most well-designed exams I've seen, right? And I've seen most of these other exams you're talking about. All right. Yeah, Zoe, you're right, and we're getting to the assumption part as well. Let me move on. So, just a final note on premises. Premises are those given statements the author uses to eventually build the case for the main conclusion. Keep that in mind. For the purpose of solving your assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate questions, premises are generally considered to be true. Usually, it's a red flag if you're finding a statement that is challenging your premise. Keep that also in mind. They're generally considered to be true. So I've just summarized the takeaways. So when you have the PDF, you can, take these takeaways as a straight slide. But yeah, we have discussed all of this. Now let's get into the next portion. We have understood arguments. Why did we have to understand arguments? Because it's at the core of assumptions. To do assumptions, you have to understand arguments. Now let's get into the meat of the matter, what we call assumptions. Now, there is somebody who is presenting an argument. You are the maker of the argument, let's say. What is an assumption? If I am the person who is making a certain argument, what is it which I have not explicitly stated, but in my head, I believe that to be true? And the key characteristic I want you to remember is this. Without this being true, with whatever I'm assuming in my head, without this being true, this argument would be nonsensical. It would not make sense. I should not be able to conclude this logically based on the given premises, right? As Zoe correctly points out, it's that glue, it's that building block that fits in the gaps. End of the day, it's something which I have not explicitly stated. It's something that's in my head somewhere, which I believe to be true, without which this argument would not be logical to make. That's the fundamental idea of what an assumption is. Now, this is a very optimistic example. I got a 735 on the GMAT recently. This yay is not a conclusion indicator, it is just your emotion. So yeah, I will definitely secure admission to my target B school. Think about this for a second. When you say that, yes, I got a 735 on the GMAT, and then when you go on to make this grand claim that, yeah, I'm going to definitely get admission to my Harvards, Whartons, IESCs, or whatever it is, you're probably assuming a lot of things, right? About your admissions, about your essays, so on and so forth. So think about that. That is the crux of assumptions. You're assuming a ton of stuff when you do that. So let's get into the characteristics of an assumption. What defines an assumption? This theory is important, and I will show you very soon why all of this matters. If you don't understand these fundamentals, you will fall for some of the trap choices, right? So there's a reason we are taking this time to do the theory. Today, most of the questions we're going to solve might be medium. Some of them are easy. In fact, doesn't matter, but we're going to build some solid fundamentals. Okay. So, what are the characteristics of an assumption? Firstly, it is an unstated idea. If I'm the person making the argument, I have not stated it anywhere. Second point, it by default brings in new information. Clearly, it's not stated, but it's also something I cannot infer. And again, think about this for a second, because a lot of you sometimes ask this question, what's the difference between assumption and inference, right? Think about the scenario, right? If these are my premises, and based on my premises, I make a conclusion, that is my argument. If my assumption is something I could infer as true, what is an inference? Something that's definitely true based on the given information. If based on the given information, I could just infer something, why would I have to assume it? I only have to assume something to be true if I don't know for sure if it's true. If it's something that's practically inferable as truth, I don't have to assume it. So that's one of the ways to think about assumption versus inference. An assumption, completely new idea, neither stated nor inferable. The key aspect, and I'll keep repeating this till it gets hammered into your unconscious and subconscious. Without this, the argument is illogical. Without the statement being true, the conclusion is not logical to make, right? Now, here is your next exercise. It's the same argument. Just tell me what is being assumed, or what all assumptions you can think of. So we did talk about that connectivity missing between Jake and Charles, right? So there must be some assumption there. What if the big schools accept only GRE? If your target schools accept only GRE, then GRE is the way to go, obviously. It depends on your target school, right? What are you gunning for? For some people, GRE is the easier exam, and for some people, GRE may be slightly tougher. Depends on the vocab portion, right? 20 marks, okay. All the best, Zoe. My wishes are with you. Hope you absolutely nail all these exams, you get what you're looking for. We could all do with some good news, right? Yeah. All right. Kanika Mayang Sagnik, thanks for that. So the answer I'm seeing so far is Jake is a better detective. So this greater sign is just my proxy for better, all right? Jake is a better detective than Charles. Everybody agrees with this? Oh, Sagnik, my error. You're talking about the argument. Great, perfect. So Zoe, you also telling me better detective than Jake. So I got 3 answers for Jake is a better detective than Charles. Anyone with a slightly different point of view? Or everybody is aligned to this idea that, I'm kind of assuming that the assumption should be that Jake is better than Charles. All right. It does look like there's alignment here. So I hope all of you pay good attention to the next portion of the session, because I am going to break that bubble a little bit. So if you told me that Jake is a better detective than Charles, for pretty much your typical GMAT assumption question, that's not an assumption. There is a small problem with this statement, that is Jake is a better detective than Charles. The second statement, something which says Jake, he could be better than Charles, but he's at least as good as Charles as a detective. This is a valid assumption. And the difference is the difference between getting a question right and getting a question wrong, right? So all of you who gave me, Jake is a better detective than Charles, think about this. So let's understand why this is so. Why is that Jake is a better detective than Charles? Why is this not a valid assumption? Right? So it actually comes into it flows from the direct definition of what an assumption is. An assumption is a necessary condition. What do I mean by that? You remember this thing I've been hammering since the start of the session? Without this statement being true, the conclusion would not be logical to make. In essence, that means it's a necessary condition. What does necessary mean? It must be true. Or in other words, if this is not true, if this assumption statement is not true, your conclusion cannot be logically made, your argument is illogical. That is what an assumption is. Now, on the GMAT, typically, and I use the word typically because if by any chance you see a question stem where they're asking you for an answer choice that is sufficient to prove the conclusion, you should change the style of analysis to that. I'm talking about your typical assumption question. The typical assumption question is asking you for what is a necessary condition. So what is necessary is what we just observed. If that statement is not true, my conclusion shatters. It's not logical anymore. What exactly is this other term called sufficient? This is how I would think of it. If that statement is true, my conclusion is practically proven. Think about it. If I give you the premise that Holt is a better detective than Jake, and if it is true that Jake is a better detective than Charles, both these statements combined, it practically proves your conclusion, right? That Holt is a better detective than Charles. There's no question about it. In other words, a statement like the one a lot of you chose, it is sufficient to make your conclusion true. But just because it is sufficient for your conclusion to hold true, that's not necessary for the conclusion to hold true. And what I want you to remember is these kinds of statements are not necessarily assumptions. And a lot of trap choices are based on this. So everybody with me so far, is the idea coming through? Am I clear? I'm gonna happy to spend more time on this. This is the crux. We could keep solving questions, but it's these fundamentals that I want to really make sure it's clear. I'm just gonna wait for a few seconds, right? So my point is there are two different types of statements. One is a necessary statement, one is a sufficient statement. Any necessary statement, anything that is really necessary for your argument to be logical, that's definitely an assumption. Anything that's sufficient, it kind of proves the assumption, not necessarily an assumption. It could be an assumption if it's along with being sufficient, it is also necessary. But you have to be the real test of what is an assumption or what is not an assumption is it necessary? This and only this. So that necessary statement may or may not be sufficient. When will it not be sufficient? If there are other assumptions. So between your premise and conclusion, I have, let's say, two assumptions. Both of them have to be true. But even if one is true, it's not sufficient. The other also has to be true. Right? So I hope necessary versus sufficient is clear. Clear. Good. Sufficient statements can be, they will be strengthened because I practically prove the conclusion. Even your necessary, Kanika, good question. Even every assumption by default is also a strengthener. The vice versa is not true. It's not necessary that every strengthener is an assumption. That's not necessarily true. But every assumption is a strengthener. So every assumption is a strengthener. A sufficient statement is a very extreme statement, which also is a strengthener because it practically proves your conclusion. If it proves my conclusion, how can I not call it a strengthener, right? But it's not an assumption. That's my point. So I hope now you guys see why statement one, Jake is a better detective than Charles, is not an assumption, right? While it is clearly sufficient, the minute I say Jake is, a better detective, it proves my conclusion beyond any doubt. But is it necessary? I would argue it's not, because let's say Holt is better than Jake as a detective. Even in the scenario that Jake is equally good as Charles, my conclusion will still survive. My conclusion will still be logical to make. So, Jake being a better detective than Charles was not necessary to begin with, which is why it doesn't fit a GMAT assumption. It doesn't fit the criteria of a GMAT assumption. On the other hand, the second statement absolutely is an assumption. Because if I negate this, you will see the argument doesn't make sense. I'm trying to conclude based on Holt being a better detective than Jake that Holt is a better detective than Charles. If Jake is not as good a detective as Charles. So if I make the statement not true, in other words, Charles is actually a better detective than Jake. In such a scenario, there's no logical basis to conclude that Holt is better because it's very realistically possible that Charles is better than Holt. It's as simple as that. Right? I hope all of this is clear. Very important concepts. Now, even in this very simple example, what we saw is it's very easy to fall for this trap. Very normal. All of us do it. If it can happen in a simple example like this, it can happen in tougher examples as well, tougher questions, right? So this is where you need to build that discipline right now. This is a very common kind of processing trap. And what exactly is the error that's happening? The way you should process your choices in assumption questions is kind of see what happens when the choice is not true. Does it make my conclusion illogical to make? That's the correct test. Instead, what we sometimes end up doing if you're not careful is, hey, if this is true, it kind of makes the conclusion believable. It seems to prove the conclusion. That must be a good assumption. Don't do this. Okay, good. So just hammering a little bit more on this point, given its importance. Here's another question. Just tell me, what is the assumption? Only one of these statements is right. Harshit, I think I answered your question. Surprised to see that repeat. Is March a good time? It really depends. Are you prepared? So a good time is defined by when you're reasonably well prepared. GMAT, as you know, is year round. So, CAT happens in a particular stretch. Some of these other exams, there's a specific timeline to it. But GMAT really depends. When you're ready, if you're trying to take the GMAT, start preparing early, start working consistently. How long it will take you will depend on your starting ability. So it's generally good practice to take a mock. So when you take a first mock, it's a diagnostic. You understand where you are, and that kind of gives you some insight into how long your prep journey can take. So that will give you a better idea on by when you'll be ready, right? But in general, March is as good a time as any. It's not like the paper is more difficult in March or something. All right. So good to see some answers flowing in. So lots of B's is to CNA as well. So all of you who told me B, I'm very happy. That means that the point that we just discussed is kind of clear. So you see this, right? Statement A is again an example of a statement that is sufficient but not necessary. If it was necessary, it would still work. The problem is it's not necessary. Think about it. If it is true that the only activity this month that could have caused an increase in sales was this marketing campaign, then the point is this essentially proves beyond doubt that this 10% increase that you saw was because of the campaign. So what choice it proves to you is that the marketing campaign was the reason behind the 10% increase in sales. And if any increase in sales comes from as a result of a campaign, that campaign is considered to be a success. So in essence, you have proven that the conclusion is true. The question is it necessary? Maybe it's not the only activity that could have caused an increase in sales. Maybe there was some other activity X or some other activity Y, which could have also caused an increase in sales. And maybe those did. Let's say a 3% increase in sales out of the observed 10% came out of X and Y. Even then, your marketing campaign might have contributed 7% to sales. And as long as it led to higher sales, even a 7% contribution works for that. The campaign was a success. Or in other words, when I make this choice not true, my argument is still holding firm. It's still surviving. That's why choice A is sufficient, but it's not necessary. I'm glad most of you are seeing this at this point, right? B, on the other hand, is a hardcore classic assumption, right? And it's a very standard, pattern that some of you do. It's because of some other reason, right? So I'm proposing that my conclusion is that campaign is a success based on, I believe that the campaign led to the sales, but what if something else led to that sales? Then I cannot say that the campaign was a success. So if the entire observed 10% increase, so not even a fraction of it, all the entire 10% was because of some other reason X, then how can I credit the marketing campaign? How how can I say it's a success when I'm not even sure if it actually led to any increase in sales? Therefore, choice B is necessary. I hope all of this is flowing into your brain. I hope it's all clear. So, if you're with me, congratulations, you just did what we call the negation test. In general, I do see a lot of people have some what do you call that, negative mindset towards. I know it's called negation, but some of us have this negative mindset. I've seen people tell me, "Hey, should I be doing this? Can I avoid this? Can I get by without it?" My take is there will always be some choices for which you do not need to do the negation test. There are choices that you can reject very easily, but usually for the tougher choices, some level of negation test will be required, because negation test is essentially an application of the fundamental definition of an assumption. So when I say that an assumption is necessary for the argument to be logical, what that means is if the assumption is not true, then my argument breaks down. And this is essentially what the negation test is all about. So imagine I have my 5 answer choices A, B, C, D, and E. Now, it so happens that A and C and E were very easily rejected, very irrelevant, completely unrelated to this particular argument. So I'm stuck with B and D. At this point, it may be wise to use the negation test. I might take the suspected assumption, let's say choice B, I will negate it. And what do I mean by negate? What is this fancy word? Nothing much. I'm just considering the logically opposite scenario. If I say that Harsha is a smart guy, the negation for that is Harsha is not a smart guy. I don't like that, but Harsha is not a smart guy, right? That's it. Now, it's of course some statements are much more difficult to negate than what I've just said, but that also is a skill, right? Now, what happens once I negate it, I have to see what it does to my argument, the impact it has on my argument. Does it make my conclusion not logical to make anymore? Then, congrats, you just identified an assumption. Why? Because you just proven that that particular choice was a necessary condition. On the other hand, if you see that the argument is still surviving, or in other words, the conclusion can still be logically made, reasonably logically made, then you're probably not dealing with a necessary condition, probably not an assumption, not a good choice. This is the negation test. You don't have to use it for every single choice out there, but you'll see that if you're very comfortable with it, it's a fantastic way to solve assumption questions, right? Is it? Yeah. Great question. It's always better to use negation test for every question, for every choice, I presume, Sagnik, that's what you mean. No, you don't have to necessarily do negation test for every choice, because some choices are so irrelevant you can reject it instantly. You might be wasting time in the exam by doing negation. So negation, think of it as a very refined tool, only as needed. But there'll be a lot of choices where it might be the easier way to analyze it, right? So how is A different from B? I think we discussed that. A is a completely different statement. What it means is completely different. A tells me that the only thing that could have caused this particular increase in sales was the marketing campaign. It's a sufficient condition. It proves my conclusion, but I don't need that. It's not necessary, right? Got it. I will call it bomb techniques. Okay. Got it. So should we pre-think? Because yeah, we're gonna get into this entire thing called pre-thinking. So everybody has views on it. The definition of pre-thinking itself is so out there. Different people attach different terms to it. So it's very hard to answer that question in a proper way. But I'll try. We'll get to it. I'll show you what works for me. Okay, and perhaps some of it might work for you as well. Right. Hmm. How to bring about negation if the option itself has two premises? Which one to negate? If the option has premise in general is considered true, that portion we don't negate. It's something that sometimes you do see information that is meant to be taken as true even within a statement. I think you're talking about that, Aditya. That is not meant to be negated. So that is the given scenario. The rest of it is what you usually negate. But yeah, I think if we see a question which deals with that statement, let's discuss that. Else do reach out to me. I'll be able to help. But yeah, in general, premise is premise. We don't challenge. We don't even for negation. I don't challenge the premise. I don't say the premise is not true. Right. All right. So we have just discussed the basics of the negation test. There's one other conceptual element that I want you to be very clear about. I don't, at least after today, I don't want it to be the case that you ever mix up an inference question and an assumption question. So I mean inference and assumption the question, right? Sometimes they may use some of the same words, and we've all seen these kinds of questions, right? So remember the fundamental difference. In a typical inference question, you are given a set of statements. The question is, okay, based on the information given, so considering that the information given is true, what is it that must be true? That's your very classic usual inference question, right? Whereas a question like this, there is an argument given to you, which means that there is some premise and there is a conclusion somewhere. Your question being asked here is, in order for the above argument to hold true, that is, in order for that conclusion to be a logically made one based on the given premises, what must be true? Here you're actually dealing with an assumption. I hope I hope you're clear with this. It really irks me. It really hurts me a little bit when I see people mix up the question type. I don't want that ever happening. Yeah. So some takeaways, we've discussed all of this. What an assumption is, I hope, is crystal clear. Characteristics of an assumption should be clear. The necessary and sufficient problem, I hope, is clear. You know what is necessary, you know what is sufficient, and I'll be sharing this PDF and all with you, so don't worry about that. So typical trap choices that we see, a sufficient choice which is not necessary. This is always a red flag, because you need that necessary for a typical assumption question. Another possible trap choice is if I give you an answer choice that's practically already known. Remember, an assumption brings in new information. So if I just give you a choice which states something that is practically given to you or just inferable, that's not a good choice, right? Negation test for very tough choices. Okay. So before we go into the next, let me field a couple of questions. Negation tends to confuse me and take a lot of time on the exam. Yeah. I usually scrutinize the options. Option A, activity was the giveaway for me. What if there were natural reasons? So, Kanika, great. I understand. So it's for some of these tougher option choices, you might have to get comfortable with negation. That's my insight there. You may not be able to escape it altogether. So what that means is you have to build a little bit of muscle in this. So I would solve a few assumption questions untimed, where as an exercise I'm going to try negating every choice out there, right, untimed, and check it against. Even nowadays you have things like ChatGPT also, but the point is, I think you might have to work a little bit on building that muscle. But once it's built, I want you to be very comfortable with negation. It will matter, right? So, all right. Yeah, inference is based on those given facts, what is true, if those facts are true, and assumption is for an argument, of course. That's the fundamental. So here is a question. So this is an official question, but I've kind of modified stuff here and there with the choices. I've played around with the choices just to drive some specific learning outcomes. Just let me know what your answer is. Choice C, by the way, is that none of A and B are assumptions. Wow, I like the confidence with which everybody's giving me C. This time, no tricks. C is the right answer. I'm very happy to see that. Last time I did play a trick on all of you. This time, All of you are right. I'm happy to see this. So clearly, the concept I wanted to drive through this example might be clear, but this is the point where I want to talk about framework. How do I solve assumption questions, or at least try to solve assumption questions? So, number one, the sequence of operations, right? I don't like looking at the question stem first, and I don't definitely don't like looking at the choices first. I believe it introduces bias. Though you might argue that looking at the question stem first is no big deal. In cases where the question stem has some details related to the argument, reading through that is a bit of a pain. So in general, I prefer to keep my sequence very simple. I read the given stimulus first, then the question stem. Then, where possible, there is this layer of analysis that I do, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. And of course, this is the business end. Let nobody tell you otherwise. You have to be able to do very good answer choice analysis if you want to do well in critical reasoning, right? That applies for all of verbal, of course. So, first step is the argument. So you try to read the argument. When you're reading, once you have read, you should have some kind of a checkpoint. You have to check with yourself, the things I read, is it clear to me? Have I understood this is an argument? Yes or no? Okay, it is an argument. Okay, what is the main conclusion? What is the justification used to arrive at the main conclusion? So there is some logic, there is some story being communicated. The author is justifying that main conclusion in some way. What is that? So it's good if you're able to have a checkpoint right here. Uh, And for those of you who have been practicing well, who have been practicing CR for quite a while, even as you read arguments, you might find issues with the argument. Like most of us are very good at finding problems, right? So, finding faults. That's a super skill in critical reasoning, right? So sometimes even as you read before you do anything else, you might find an issue with the argument. For instance, in the previous question, what is Jake's height with regard to Charles? The author is not talking about it. There might be an issue there, things like that. So if something becomes apparent, I'm very, very happy. Even otherwise, absolutely okay, no problem. But I do try to ensure that I've understood the conclusion and the justification even at this point. Sometimes it might still get missed. Now, question stem, you don't want to mix up inference or assumption or any other question type. uh, you know be very, very clear about the question stem, what it's giving you, what it's asking you to do. Then comes analysis. Now, for all argument based questions, so I'm talking about everything which has these main conclusion. So, assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate, flaw, even boldface. One of the things that I like to do is this. I have a checkpoint here, and this check is compulsory. So sometimes you read the argument and just in flow state, you move all the way here. But here, this checkpoint is compulsory for me because now I've read the argument, I've read the question, I know I'm dealing with an assumption question. For an assumption question, or rather for all your argument based questions, that conclusion is very, very important. So it pays dividends, it pays rewards to again focus on the conclusion. So I will always come back to the conclusion, read it again, make sure the ideas are hammered into my head, right? Now, with a very tough question where even understanding the logic is a little difficult, I will focus on extracting the justification. Like, how is the author arriving at this conclusion? The answer to that question. I will focus on that. In a lot of cases, you may not have to do this because it's already clear from your reading of the argument. But this main conclusion, compulsory. And I'll show you why. Because all your answer choice analysis is going to be tied to that particular conclusion, right? Right. So now this portion is entirely optional. Um, Sometimes at this point, given that you spent some time with the conclusion, you've tried to understand how the author has arrived at that conclusion. Sometimes you might be able to figure out issues or problems with the argument. The logic gaps might present themselves to you. If that happens, that is great. I try to do this. This is what some of us would like to call pre-thinking. It is useful, especially for the definitely for the easier, medium, and moderately hard questions. Sometimes with the very hard questions, it's still very useful, but of course the answer choice will be very twisted. So the business end is anyway answer choice analysis, right? So then comes choices. Choices, be very, very granular. This is for all of verbal. Just because you read something doesn't mean you understood it. So if you read a choice, spend some time, pause for a second. This pause is for you to check if you have understood what the choice is trying to tell you. Once you have done that, you actually made sure you have understood what the choice is trying to tell you. Only then analyze. And analysis we have discussed. Some choices will be easy to reject. Some choices, tougher choices, you might have to go in for things like the negation test. All right. That's a little bit about process. Bear with me for the theory of it. So let's solve this particular question. I think all of you were able to give me the correct answer. So I think it is clear. Sulfite is commonly added as a preservative to wines. Okay. The sulfite causes allergy to many people. All of that is clear. What's the conclusion? The people who like the wine but have sulfite allergy, they can drink these wines. What are these wines? Wines with have no added sulfite. This key portion is very important. I'm happy none of you faltered here. Without risking sulfite allergy, right? So the author claims that, hey, if you're somebody who likes wine but has these sulfite allergies, you can drink these wines without risking sulfite allergy. Very, very clear on that. Okay. And the justification is very clear. The point being made in favor of this is that these wines do not contain added sulfite. So if you take a step back and think about this for a second, one of the immediate ideas that might come to your mind is, okay, there is no added sulfite. But what if, let's say, sulfite is naturally present? Sulfite might be present in the grapes that constitute the wine, or sulfite might leach in from the containers. The container might contain sulfite and it might kind of leach into the wine. There's other ways that sulfite can get into the wine, right? Something like that might come to your mind. Great if it happens, great if it doesn't. Either way, answer choice analysis. So I can see that most of you were able to get this, but let's discuss. So I did see that one of you chose choice B. So why is B not correct? The key is being clear on the conclusion. Remember, the conclusion is not about whether this particular wine is safe to drink, right? If safe to drink as in safe from any allergy. That's not the conclusion. The conclusion is this wine is drinkable as far as sulfite allergy is concerned. If you are somebody who has a sulfite allergy and wants to drink this wine, who likes wine, you could drink this wine without risking sulfite allergy, an allergic reaction to sulfite. It doesn't mean that it's safe in general. It doesn't mean that you will not get any other allergy. So the conclusion is very, very specific, right? So apart from sulfites, there are no substances commonly present that give rise. The point is, even if there are substances, it's irrelevant to your conclusion. The conclusion is about sulfite allergy and nothing else, right? So none of the answers here are assumptions. I'm happy to see that. So which is the assumption here? So take a minute. I think most of you should be able to get this at this point. All right, good to see that. I hope you guys can see why E works, right? It should immediately hit you. So it looks like this is clear. I'm sharing the PDF anyway. If you want to go through why NA is wrong or why B is wrong, you could go through it later. Let's move to the next idea. So why is this focus on analyzing logic gaps, looking for logic gaps where possible, right? It is a good practice for a couple of reasons. Number one, GMAT is still a test. It's still testing you on some things that they expect you to do in a boardroom in the future. In real life, you don't have answer choices. If somebody presents an argument to you, you should be able to do a critical analysis of it. That's my personal belief. But of course, from a test perspective, also it can help if you're able to look for if you're able to develop an eye for logic gaps, right? So the reason for that is, of course, if you look at these gaps in logic that we identified, the problems, the issues that we identified with some of these arguments, invariably you'll find an assumption there. Your assumptions are always tied very closely to your logic gaps. So if you're able to find those, you'll be able to find assumptions. The simple fundamental here is this: an assumption plugs or fills a particular logic gap. So if an argument has a lot of logical issues, it essentially means I need a lot of assumptions just to make that argument work, right? And you know this from real life. So it pays dividends to quickly and organically think of logic gaps. When you're doing untimed practice, you really should consciously focus on doing this because the muscle gets built so that in time circumstances, you'll still be able to do it very well, right? That's about it. That's essentially, that's exactly why we do this. So just to summarize, one of the things I want you to remember is this conclusion clarity. It's very important to be crystal clear on the conclusion. That helped us reject a choice like B, right? We don't care about the wine. The conclusion is not about the wine being safe in general, that it's not going to cause any allergy. No, the conclusion is that it's not going to cause sulfite allergies. So very, very specific nature of it. We have to be very precise with conclusion. Otherwise, all these assumption questions, they're going to be very tricky, right? So, and of course, don't shy away from this thing called negation test. I want you to embrace it and be very comfortable with it, right? So now let's change track a little bit. We'll discuss some common patterns which hopefully will help you. Uh, Whenever I discuss patterns, I have to give the small caveat. That is, the patterns are there only for us to refer and learn from. You should not rely on patterns ever. The test maker who knows to create patterns also knows to break them. But patterns are useful because once you recognize patterns, pattern recognition kicks in. Sometimes you're able to move faster. Okay. So let's talk about causal arguments. Causal arguments, as the name suggests, there is a cause and effect relationship somewhere. Sometimes in the conclusion, sometimes somewhere in the premises, but you will see cause effect relationships. Here is one example, and it's not a regular question. I'm giving you a very framework type of question just to get you to think what would be an assumption or what would be the logic gaps here. Whenever X happens, Y also happens, therefore X causes Y. What would be assumptions or logic gaps that you would identify here? All right, correlation is being assumed as causation. Yeah, of course. That is definitely an issue here. That is definitely the issue here. X is the only contributor to Y. Okay. That may not be a problem per se. There could be other contributors that may not be a problem. But yeah, X may or may not cause Y. Okay. Correlation cannot be causation. It could be, but it need not be. All right, great. It might follow. All of this is right. So let's kind of discuss this. So the author gives us a fact that whenever X happens, Y happens. It seems to suggest that there's at least some kind of a relationship. Clearly, there is some correlation here. And as Sagnik correctly pointed out, the author is jumping to the conclusion that there is a causality here. Clearly, there is a correlation there, but is there a causality? That's what you should ask. Just because whenever X happens, Y happens, how can I just assume that X causes Y? What if, for example, it's not X that causes Y, it is Y that causes X? Is that a possibility? Because even then, you would observe that whenever X happens, Y happens. Or what if it's actually the case that there is some other Z which causes X and Y, which is why you see that whenever X happens, Y also happens, because this Z is causing both X and Y. So things like that. What if some other factor P is the sole cause of Y? So I'm adding this phrase. Something else could also cause Y. But if I give you a statement which says some other factor is the only thing that could have caused Y, that again puts a bullet hole through this X causes Y argument, right? Everybody with me? You're understanding what this is? You're just observing some general patterns here. So what would be the assumptions that follow from this? So the gap is, what if Y causes X? It's not the case that Y causes X. Now that would actually be an assumption. And if you once you start solving CR questions, once you start reviewing them, you will see some of these patterns in causal arguments. right? And that's useful. So here are the equivalent assumptions. We have already discussed the gaps here. So it's not the case that some other factor is causing both. Some other factor P is not the sole cause. All of this makes sense. Great. So here is a very slight variation of it. The only difference is in the premise. And therefore, there's one additional layer that comes in. What I know is in the last 3 years, it has been observed that whenever X has happened, Y has also happened. Now, this in the last 3 years kind of gives you this idea that it may not even be a correlation. It could simply be a coincidence. So it could simply be coincidence. Maybe there's forget correlation, forget causality, it's just coincidence. Now that's a possible logical gap. What if X and Y happening together in these last 3 years has nothing to do with X causing Y or anything like that? It's just pure coincidence. Now that also is a logical gap. So here is an equivalent assumption to that. The rest is the same. So when you solve a lot of these causal arguments, you will see some of these patterns very common. I do remember last week I was checking out some of the questions in the focus edition. Same pattern, it is there. And the point is not to mug up these patterns. That's not the point here. The point is just to be familiar with it, right? So that your brain has some pattern recognition. So here is a question. Let's solve. All right, good. A lot of E's. Any other answers, or everyone is very clear that this one is an E? Perfect. Excellent. E is, of course, the right answer. And again, I want to make sure that that process is also happening, right? Make sure that you're very clear about the conclusion. Think about how the author is trying to justify this conclusion. And if possible, in untimed, do try to analyze it further and try to figure out how this entire conclusion is being made. What could be the logic issues, right? So, what's happening here? The conclusion the author is making here is that cannabinoids probably function to stimulate the appetite. Okay, so these cannabinoids, they probably function to stimulate the appetite. So how is the author arriving at this conclusion? End of the day, there were two groups that were being studied. One group had mice, regular mice, no chemical interjection, nothing, right? No chemical injection, nothing. So just had cannabinoids and nothing else. And here we saw regular normal appetites. The other group, the impact, they used a certain chemical to kind of prevent the cannabinoids from reaching the brain receptors. It kind of prevented it from hitting the brain, right? By injecting a certain chemical. And what was the noted effect? lesser appetite. So, given the fact that, at least in the study, by kind of preventing the cannabinoids from reaching the brain receptor, we observed a lower appetite. There came about this conclusion that that probably means that cannabinoids tend to stimulate appetite. So the argument is very clear. So one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, what if this chemical that's added, it's a new variable, right? What if this chemical is the culprit? The cannabinoid did nothing to reduce the appetite, it was actually the chemical itself. Then can you still make this conclusion? Because then this observed reduction in appetite has nothing to do with cannabinoids, it has everything to do with the chemical. So it's not logical to make that conclusion anymore. The logic of this is clear, right? I could think of something else also. What if there is some other chemical, X, which is actually the one that is stimulating appetite? And it so happens that whenever this particular chemical that was injected also tends to inhibit X, it's preventing X from reaching the receptor. So everything that the author attributed to cannabinoid actually applies to X as well. So we don't know for sure if this conclusion is legit anymore. Can I make this conclusion about cannabinoids when there is this X which does the same? That's essentially the other point. My point is not about that. It's about this one. I believe this is choice E. Any doubts? Any of you had any confusions with any of the choices here? Just checking. The chemical is present in cannabinoids. No, we're talking about a chemical that was injected, Sagnik. Just checking. I mean, researchers injected mice with a chemical that is known to block cannabinoids. It's not a chemical that is present in cannabinoids. Those are two different things. I hope that clarifies. So it looks like we are clear with this. So let's move on. So point is, causal arguments, you get a lot of them on the GMAT, not just with assumptions. You'll see that with strength and weakness. It's a very popular question type. It pays to try and figure out what the logic gaps are. Here I ask the question, when can I not make this conclusion, right? So between B and E, E is yeah, if you're wondering why B is wrong, this only is a red flag. Only is always a dangerous word. Sometimes it's a correct answer, sometimes it's an incorrect answer. You have to be very careful. It changes meaning a lot, right? So if I talk about choice B, if I negate choice B, it doesn't have to be that cannabinoids are the only substances that stimulate appetite. There could be other things, but the author is still making the point that cannabinoids stimulate appetite. There could be other things, but the fact of the matter is, as per the study, when we inhibited cannabinoids, we actually saw a reduction in appetite. So irrespective of where are other substances that stimulate appetite, it could still be the case that cannabinoids themselves do stimulate appetite. So that only makes choice B a problem. But yeah, that's good. So now let's talk about another very, very important type of questions. You'd see a lot of this on the GMAT as well. Plan or proposal, plan goal kind of arguments. Very simple. The passage or the argument describes a certain plan, and you're given a certain goal of the plan, a goal or an objective, what the plan is supposed to do, right? And the conclusion is usually related to either the plan succeeding or the plan not succeeding. Sometimes you have to find an assumption for the plan success. Sometimes you have to weaken the chance that the plan will succeed, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's usually ties down to the plan and the objective of the plan, the goal, right? So here, I also wanted to be a little extra careful. Sometimes what I have observed is, and this could be true with the other questions as well, but clearly here, sometimes what you'll see is the stimulus itself is a passage. The question stem contains the conclusion that you need. Now, an example of that is something like this. Your given information is just this. There is a plan X which has a goal Y. Your question stem contains the crux of it. What must be true for the plan to achieve its goal, right? So if I give you a question like this, you have to think in terms of what is it that can prevent this plan from achieving its goal. If you can think about that, you might be able to, identify the logical issues here. What would prevent the plan, right? You might be able to arrive at those assumptions. In any case, you have answer choices. So here is, this is a very interesting question. I've slightly modified it for our discussion today to deliver some specific points. Let's try. Let me know what the answer is, and then let's discuss. Now we are seeing all types of answers. Couple of E's. There's a B. There's a D. Okay. This one is high up on the difficulty scale. The original question is already 700 level, and I've kind of tinkered with it to make it a bit tougher for the purpose of learning. Right. Kanika also tells me E. All right, let's discuss. So, what's happening here? Again, this is a good example of what I mean when I say a plan goal kind of question in an assumption format. So, if you read this section, you notice that there's no conclusion. This is all straight up facts. There's no claim being made. I know it's an assumption question primarily from the question stem, right? So let's understand what's happening. To reduce traffic congestion. So with the objective of reducing traffic congestion, City X's Transportation Bureau, it plans to encourage people who work downtown to sign a form pledging to carpool or use public transport for the next year. So I hope this is clear as you read, right? So the plan is there are all these people who are working in the downtown area of the city. You're trying to encourage them to sign a form. This form is basically them pledging or promising to do carpooling or public transport for the next year. Everyone who signs the form will get a free coupon or a free meal coupon for a free meal at any downtown restaurant. Okay, all of that is good. Couple more B's came in. Okay, all of that is good. So B and E are very popular, and we'll figure out which one is right. Now, what is the question? For the Transportation Bureau's plan to succeed in reducing traffic congestion, which of the following must be true? So this is where the question is very clear. So there is a plan. For this plan to achieve its goal, that's what you would define as success, right? And in this case, for it, that means for this plan to reduce traffic congestion, what is it that must be true? So for all practical purposes, the conclusion here is that this particular plan will reduce traffic congestion. And I want you to be very clear with what this conclusion is. It doesn't say that you have to reduce traffic congestion by 50%, 80%, 100%. In other words, even a peanut size reduction is a reduction. The plan will succeed if you reduce traffic congestion even by, let's say, a 2%. I hope that is also clear. Now I see an A as well. Okay. So if this is clear, let's again think about what could be the logical issue? What would be the issue here? What would be the gap? And I asked the question, okay, the plan will succeed. The conclusion is that the plan will succeed in reducing traffic congestion. When will the plan not succeed? What will make this plan not succeed? So when you think about that, in other words, when will traffic congestion not reduce? When you think about that, one of the first things that comes to mind is, hey, you have all these people who are signing this pledge. But signing a pledge doesn't mean that they will abide by the pledge, right? What if none of those people who signed the pledge ever abide by the pledge in the whole next year? Imagine you got 100 people to sign the pledge, but not even once during the next year did they abide by the pledge. Then how is your plan going to succeed? Think about that. There is another idea that can come to mind. So the plan is about getting these people who work downtown, let this be downtown, right? To get those people to start doing carpooling or public transport rather than use their own vehicles. My question is, what if these guys are not causing any traffic congestion even right now? So if these are people who are already, let's say, using the public bus, they are not contributing at all to traffic congestion in the city, then what is your plan really doing? Right? Right? Think about that. So E is the answer, by the way. I'm happy some of you were able to get it. But we did see quite a few candidates for B, some for D, some for B, and a couple of A's as well. Shweta, great question. But that not abiding thingy is not ethical. GMAT doesn't ask. Uh, you know, in fact, this is the official question, and the choice C is the official answer. It's my untinkered answer. It is the right answer. That's the only thing I'll tell you. So, just because you got people to sign the pledge doesn't mean that they will abide by the pledge. That is clearly, it may not be an ethics thing, right? A lot of times we sign on a lot of things, and it's hard for us to keep track of it. It's hard for us to abide by it. Somebody comes up to you and makes you sign something. Will I say that I'm not being ethical if I don't follow that random pledge that I took? You know, this may not fall into that category, is what I'm trying to get at, Shweta. But great. So let's understand why each of these choices is wrong. Some of you chose choice A, but if you chose choice A, you know what that tells me? It tells me that this attention to detail factor was not there. Notice this. The plan is to encourage people to do carpooling and public transport for the whole next year, for the whole of next year. Therefore, there is this idea that I can sometimes abide by the pledge, I can sometimes not abide by the pledge. I may fully abide by the pledge, I may partially abide by the pledge. Now, let me ask you the question. Is it really necessary that people fully abide by the pledge? What if, let's say, 60% of the people who signed the pledge abide by the pledge, let's say 60% of the time? Will the conclusion not hold true? You should still see a certain level of traffic congestion reduction, right? Your traffic congestion should still reduce, right? So if you chose choice A, that means this attention to detail factor, which CR is absolutely zoned in on it. You really need to have attention to detail in CR. RC not as much, but CR you absolutely need to zone in on the details. Is choice A clear? Do I need this fully abiding to happen? What if only 60% of the people who sign the pledge abide by the pledge only like 50-60% of the time? I should still see some traffic congestion, right? Some reduction in the traffic congestion, which is why this choice is not necessarily true, right? Okay. So for those of you who chose choice A, is this clear? Can you just let me know so that I can move? Uh, Meanwhile, choice B is very, very popular. So wait a second. Do I see Shweta's question? Harsha, could you please scroll up and get my question? How do I negate the at least some? Think logically. What would be the logical negation of at least some? I say that there's at least some people. There's at least one person. The logical negation is none. If I say, if I give you the statement, at least some of the people who work downtown do something, the negation of it is none of those people. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, it's none. Yes, Rahul, fully abide is issue. I hope that's clear. Let's look at choice B, which is one of the very popular candidates, but it's incorrect. Now, why is that incorrect? It's almost right. This requires another aspect of doing well in critical reasoning, all questions, not just assumption. So, choice A was about this factor I like to call attention to detail. You should really, your brain should process for the next year and understand what it means. Choice B is about really good visualization of what's happening. Just imagine the scenario, visualize the scenario. This is my downtown area, the circle is downtown, the circle is downtown. Is it really necessary that at least some of those people, at least one of those persons, let's say, who's working downtown, cause traffic congestion in the downtown region? Or imagine the scenario, just picturize this. Imagine I am this person who is working downtown. Let's say this is my daily routine. I cause a lot of traffic congestion on my way to downtown. I use my car. I'm causing traffic congestion on the way to the downtown region. But once I'm here, I'm walking to my office. So, zero traffic congestion in the downtown area, a lot of traffic congestion in the non downtown regions. So, if you chose choice B, first you have to think about how well you're processing the choices. Did you understand the exact meaning of choice B? That's the first question. It doesn't say at least some of the people who work downtown cause traffic congestion in city X. That would be a correct choice you cannot reject. Choice B says at least some of those people cause traffic congestion in the downtown region of city X. Now the question is it necessary that even one person causes traffic congestion in the downtown region? The answer is it's not necessary. Even if the scenario is such that you have all these people who cause a lot of traffic congestion on their way to downtown and cause zero traffic congestion in the downtown region, even then, if these guys suddenly start carpooling or using public transport, your conclusion will hold true. You should see your traffic congestion come down. For all of you who chose choice B, is this kind of making sense? The downtown region is the problem, Shweta and others. Look at the this one, right? This entire question is about reducing traffic congestion in the city. It's not about reducing traffic congestion just in one particular downtown region. It's a citywide initiative, right? Great question. So a lot of you were wise to reject choice C. The problem is this word like most. Like, do you need most of the traffic congestion to result from those people? No. They may only 40% of traffic congestion comes from those people who work downtown. But if you can still make them do carpooling, you should expect to see a reduction in traffic congestion. A couple of you chose choice D, which was very interesting for me. D, I would argue, is the easiest choice to reject here. Why? Think about, again, it all comes down to, are you clear about the conclusion? Is the conclusion in your head while you're solving these choices, right? What is the conclusion? What is it you're trying to find an assumption for? That this plan will reduce by traffic congestion. Do I really care whether this is the most effective plan? Do I have to assume that this is the most effective way? It may be the least effective way, but as long as it reduces my traffic congestion, it is still a success, right? So I don't have to assume that the most effective way is essentially this way. This is describing this particular plan, right? Is this clear? So of course, by elimination, choice E is right. Some of you gave me that answer as well. But let's also negate choice E. Let's do the negation exercise for choice E and see what happens. And the way I like to do negation is not very grammatically. It's more understand the logical idea and try to go for the opposite way. What is choice C essentially telling me? At least some of those people who receive the coupon. Again, who are the people who receive the coupon? It's essentially the people who sign the form. So at least some of those people who sign the form will sometimes, at least sometimes, they will do carpooling during the next year. So at least some of the people will at least sometimes do carpooling the next year. What is a negation? Logical opposite of it. Not even one person is going to be doing this even once in the next year. That's the exact logical opposite, right? So if that is the case, if not even a single person who receives the coupon for a free meal, or in other words, if not even a single person who is signed this pledge, who said that they will abide by the pledge, if none of those people are going to follow this pledge or abide by this pledge even once during the next year, so this sometimes also is not happening, then how can you expect your plan to succeed in reducing traffic congestion? So I just discussed the negation. I hope this is helpful. You should be right. Think logically. What is the idea being communicated? That at least some people will at least sometimes be doing this. So the exact opposite of is nobody's going to do it even once. If nobody, none of those people who have signed this pledge are going to follow this pledge even once during the next year, that fundamentally breaks down your argument. Is this clear? Firstly, is choice B clear? Why is choice B not the right answer? That in the downtown region of City X changes a lot of things. You should be focusing on the impact of that. That is where actual visualization, putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who's doing that journey, it will help you crack a choice like that. You will need that for really, really tough choices. That's why we're discussing it. And what about choice C? Firstly, it actually flows directly from what we could figure out, but of course that's not going to happen all the time. As far as the choice is concerned, what happens if I negate it? Why is it necessary? Because if it is not true, if I say that it is not the case that at least some people who receive the coupon will sometimes do carpooling, it essentially means that nobody's going to be doing carpooling next year. None of these people who have signed the pledge are going to be doing carpooling, not even sometimes. It's not going to happen at all. Then how can you expect the plan to work? Right? Very quick show of hands. Is this clear? I hope this helped. Quite a few learnings from this question. I did see a lot of us falter here, right? Some of those choices, like your choice B, requires strong visualization of what's happening. By visualization, I mean actually forming the picture. Imagine you're that person who's making the journey. See what happens. Do you really need to be contributing to traffic in the downtown region? Think about that. Is that necessary? That's what you're talking about. Some of you went for choice A. For those of you who went for choice A, what is the issue there? Very clearly, that for the next year. Do you really need this for the next year? Rather, you have to see what is the impact of that for the next year. It means that it's not a singular event. If we were talking about a certain, singular event, like there is a concert, there is a concert of your favorite musician, and for this particular concert, you're discussing whether to follow the pledge or not, whether you will do carpooling or not. It's a simple yes or no. For on that day, for that event, either you do carpooling or you don't do carpooling. Either you use public transport or you don't do public transport. But when you're talking about a commitment for the whole of next year, that fully really matters. There is a concept of abiding by the pledge fully, abiding by the pledge partially, so on and so forth. Yeah. Juan has added this. None of the people who receive the coupon will sometimes carpool during will carpool even sometimes. Yeah, will carpool even sometimes during the next year. That should be right. That's E negated. None of the people who have received the coupon will carpool at least once. Will Manisha, you're almost right. I wouldn't say at least once. I would say even once. The idea is, but I think you got the idea, right? Because think about what this choice is telling you. It says at least some people will at least sometimes do carpooling. So if you go the other way, nobody's doing carpooling, right? So negation, by the way, is something that it takes a bit of getting used to. Uh, for me, this session is proof positive that a lot of us need work here. So think about that. One of the exercises that I would do, and I do this with some of my students also, we create negation specific exercises where the only exercise is a lot of tough sentences, practice negation. Right? It's a very good exercise. I think for those of you who are struggling a little bit with this should be the way to go. All right. Can we move? Let me know, guys. Let me go. Where are we? How are we? Is choice E clear? Is B clear? Because we did take a pretty tough question this time. But again, what I want to do is observe I want you to observe the fairly systematic way of doing things. Read the argument, make sure you're very clear about the question, make sure you're clear about the conclusion and the justification. Usually it's very important. Once that is done, if possible, when you're doing untimed, really try to think about what the problems in the argument are, what the issues in the argument are, what the gaps in logic are. In the time scenario, if it works, great, else go to choices. In choices, sometimes you might have to do negation test, right? This choice you might have to really do it to understand why it is the right answer. Also, we discussed certain CR really rewards attention to detail. Something as innocent as for the next year has such an impact which can make you choose or not choose a choice like A, right? And another key lesson I wanted to drive through this particular question is the importance of these quantifier words. In fact, it's also one of the common exercises that we usually give, right? If this is a quantifier, what would be the negation? If I give you some, what should be the negation? What if I give you at least one, what should be the logical negation? You have to be very careful and precise with this. It's worth your time to spend a bit of time on this on your own as well, because the tiniest distortion here can make things difficult. All right, now let's talk about another very, golden zone as far as traps are concerned. A lot of traps come here, both in CR and RC. This is called comparisons. Now, keeping it very simple, I'm cutting through all the complexity of it, just giving you simple examples. All I want you to remember is this. If I give you the statement X is richer than Y, just remember that does not imply that X is rich. For all you know, both of them are poor. It just so happens that X is slightly richer than Y, right? So it sounds very silly when I say it with such a simple example, but in fairly complex CRs and RCs, we often make this mistake. What is given in the argument or the passage is simply a comparison. X is richer than Y. And somewhere in the answer choice, we are assuming that X is rich. You have to be very careful of these traps. They're ridiculously common, right? So here is a question that's kind of touching on the comparison. This is a medium level question. I don't expect too much of a struggle here. Let's see what happens and then discuss this. Right, good. I see a lot of C's here. Anyone with a different answer, or C is very clear? I think after the last one, this one should feel a little bit better. C is the right answer. I'm happy to see that. But again, let's be very systematic. What's happening here? Think about what the argument is giving us. So, political advocacy groups, they've started to use information services to what? To do what? To disseminate information which is accessed by the public by PC. So, it's like seems to be early advent of internet types, right? Since many groups are thus able to bypass traditional news sources whose reporting is selective and to present their views directly to the public, this is the conclusion, right? Got it. So I'm happy to see that none of us have struggled here. So I will move a little fast through this. So what is the conclusion being made? And again, observe the question, which of the following is an assumption on which the argument about depends. So clear cut, we need an assumption, necessary condition. It's all clear. The conclusion is that information services present a more balanced picture on the complexities of political issues than any traditional news presents. So I want you to notice the comparative nature here. I'm essentially making the conclusion that information services, it presents a more balanced or nuanced picture compared to the traditional news sources. So it's more balanced and nuanced, right? And essentially, what is my justification for this? Is this criticism of the traditional news source, right? That, yeah, these guys are doing very selective reporting. So these guys, selective reporting, therefore perhaps biased. And therefore, these information sources, whatever they present, it's clearly much more balanced and nuanced. So the argument logic is very clear. Immediately, when I see that there are these two entities being compared, what comes to mind? I'm making this conclusion, but I've not really told you anything about information sources. The immediate idea that comes to mind is, what if whatever comes up with through the information sources is also extremely biased, extremely selective in terms of the information, extremely one-sided? So if information sources are equally or even worse, for instance, it's pretty much as bad as the other one, then how can I say that this one is more balanced, right? Which is kind of what choice C is harping on, right? It says information on political issues disseminated through information services does not come almost entirely from advocacy groups that share a single bias. In other words, what this choice is trying to say is, hey, your information sources are also pretty biased, man. They are one-sided, they are biased. The information that is coming out through these portals, through these information sources, is going to be biased. Then on what basis are you making this conclusion, right? That's why choice C works. The negation of it breaks the conclusion. Um, I don't think any of you struggled with any of the other choices, so I will leave it there. Let's move on. Let me know if there's any choice that you want me to discuss. It looks like most of you are clear. I'll just take 5 seconds in case there's something. All right. Thanks for that, Shweta. Yeah. C, quite hard to understand. All right, let's discuss this. It did look like most of us got it, but let's discuss this all the same. So remember what the conclusion is, what is being told to us. Let's start there again. The information sources. So information sources is where political advocacy groups have started pushing their information. They've started using these information sources to present, their views. Think of this like it's kind of like the early internet or something like that, right? So political advocacy groups have started using these internet information services. Um, the traditional news sources are given to us. Their reporting is selective, therefore prone to bias. The conclusion being made is information services presents a much more balanced or rather unbiased picture of the complexities of political issues. Now, choice C says information on political issues which are disseminated through the information services does not come almost entirely from advocacy groups that share a single bias. If I negate this, essentially I'm testing if this is a necessary condition. If I negate choice C, it tells me that information on political issues, which are disseminated through these information services, they come almost entirely from adversary groups that share a bias, that have a single bias. In other words, what choice C negated is telling me is that information sources, it's also a biased stream of news. Is that coming through? Think about it, right? I'm telling you that whatever information is available on information sources, most of it comes from advocacy groups which have a very, very biased perspective. They have a specific bias. They're supporting, let's say, a specific political party. A very specific line of ideas is being shared there. In other words, choice C negated is telling you that your information services are also not going to give you a balanced perspective. It's going to give you a biased perspective, right? Kanika, that's a great question. I had a little hesitation with almost and C, but even if the information is not biased and most is, it tips off the balance. That is correct. See, the point is, if it is almost entirely coming from the adversary group, it does tip the scale. End of the day, the message being communicated, the main idea being communicated is that this information, this information service, the news that you're getting out of it, it's not balanced. It is also biased, right? That almost makes no difference in this context because it is kind of clearly telling you that pretty much what you're getting from this is biased information. So, Juan and Shweta, is that clear? Choice C, why it works? Because think about how the argument was constructed. The author went on to conclude that information services presents a balanced picture, balanced as in non-biased picture, only on the basis of the fact that your traditional news is clearly biased. But if it is the case that your information sources are also biased, then how can you say that information sources are more balanced? It doesn't make sense, right? And that is that comparative element at play. My traditional news sources given to me, their selective reporting is happening, those are clearly biased. My claim is that information services, they don't have that bias, they are balanced. But choice C, when I negate it, it's telling me most of the information that is being disseminated through those information services, it's coming from some specific advocacy groups which have a bias. So most of the information that you will see on these information services will have a bias. So if that one also has a bias, how can I really claim that this is better than the other? That comparison doesn't make sense anymore, right? That's all. So Shweta also shared choice A, right? So let's look at choice A. Choice A says information services are accessible to enough people to ensure that political advocacy groups can use these services. So here is a problem with choice A. My argument is concerned with whether or not information services is more balanced than traditional news. It has nothing to do, the argument is not at all concerned whether as to whether information services is accessible enough, what kind of reach it has, is it able to reach the same kind of numbers that your traditional news resources has. Doesn't matter, right? Irrespective of what kind of people, what number of people are reached, irrespective of how accessible to people, what is the argument about, what is the conclusion about? Is it about the number of people reached, is it about the accessibility, or is it about whether or not information services present a more balanced picture? Shweta, does that help? That's fundamentally the issue here. Choice A is not relevant to the conclusion we are trying to find an assumption for. It's not just the percentage. It's not just the percentage. The entire idea being communicated is not relevant. What is the argument about? Is the information service more balanced than the traditional news? Yes or no? That's what the argument is about. What is choice A telling you? Oh, it reaches a lot of people. It reaches at least as large a percentage as the traditional news. Why do we care? That's the point. All right, let's move. So this I'll just leave it here. It's one of the more rarely seen examples. But just to give a very quick example, sometimes based on a specific sample, you draw conclusions about a population, right? So, for instance, you see that 65% of respondents in a particular survey said something. Therefore, that should apply for most of, I mean, the entire population. The problem with these kinds of conclusions is you're kind of assuming that your sample is a representative sample, right? I rarely see this type, so let's just move on. Now, this I do want to discuss because there is something going on here. So sometimes you will see the premise is talking about some x something, and suddenly, all of a sudden, in your conclusion, you'll be talking about something completely different, which is so far not a term or an idea or a concept, so far not at all seen anywhere. Now, whenever that happens, I want your radar to pick it up. So it's like the entire passage was talking about Christmas, and suddenly the conclusion is about Diwali. Your brain has to pick that up, right? Because usually there is a big logical jump there. Usually there is a huge assumption there. So a simple example of that was this question. For some, to some level, this is also an example. Randomly, I threw Charles into the conclusion. You have no idea about Charles till this point, right? So your radar should immediately get triggered there. Like, clearly there's some missing link here. And in this case, what was the missing link? That relationship between Jake and Charles. That was the missing link, right? I gave you something to connect Holt and Jake. The conclusion was between Holt and Charles. The missing link was between Jake and Charles. So now this was a very easy example, but what you will see is there are some questions where some questions at 705 level, 805 level, which are very tough to decode. One of the useful things that I'm able to do with some of these questions is to represent what is being given in terms of simple alphabets. So if you're talking about a certain entity, I want to call that HA or ABC or whatever it is. And just actually write down and try to figure out what the missing link should be. We're going to see this through an example, but the point is whenever you see the conclusion suddenly talking about something else entirely, pay attention. There's usually a very big jump there. Okay. So here is an example. This is a fairly tough example. Let's see how many of us are able to do this well. Let's have fun with it. Sagnik, in CR, every word matters. In RC, in CR, you don't know what word is important going in. You have to treat every word as if it's important. So look at the last question as an example. That for the next year actually mattered so much. You may think it's so silly, but it mattered so much, right? So CR rewards you for focusing on the nitty-gritty details as well. You should focus on those keywords, right? Manisha, absolutely. All assumptions are plugging some logical jump. Whenever in all these questions, at the end of the day, you do see a logical jump from the premise to the conclusion. An assumption is something that tries to plug that logical jump. So you're absolutely right when you say that. But also to your point, Manisha, you've written the services are balanced. The conclusion is those services are more balanced than the other. So, we were talking about comparisons. I really want you to be very clear on that. A couple of answers coming in. So most of us you are going for B. I'm very happy to see that B is right. This one is not actually easy. It goes into it goes into that 655 to 705, or what we call 705. I mean 700 level these days, right? So good. Here, what I wanted to observe is that aspect which I just talked about. You're trying to find that missing link somewhere. Firstly, let's understand the argument. What's given to us? When exposed to a mirror, most animals, what do? They exhibit some kind of social behavior, such as aggression. In other words, they're not able to recognize themselves. No mirror self recognition, no MSR. So it's interesting that we have MSR here, right? So no MSR, no mirror self recognition is happening. They think that it is somebody else, therefore they're showing something like aggression, which is social behavior. But great apes are an exception. Great apes, they are showing self-directed behaviors. In other words, they're able to recognize that they're looking at themselves. In other words, mirror self-recognition. So most animals don't have MSR, don't show mirror self-recognition. Great apes are able to show MSR. The conclusion is that this study, so this particular study that we just saw, it implies, it suggests that great apes have a capacity for self-awareness, which is unique among non-human species. So very interesting. So the conclusion suddenly, if you notice, starts talking about something called capacity for self-awareness, which so far we did not see. So the premise was that yes, great apes have this MSR, mirror self-recognition, that other animals, other non-human species don't have. From that, the author goes on to jump to the conclusion that, hey, therefore, great apes have the capacity for self awareness, which is unique among non human species. So these other species do not have that, right? So when I think about it, the author is clearly forming some linkage between MSR, mirror self recognition, and capacity for self awareness. So if there is an answer choice that I'm looking for, I would look for a linkage between the two, right? For instance, is the author kind of telling you that if a species has mirror self recognition, it automatically means that it has capacity for self awareness? This, I think, is probably definitely true, because think about, if I'm able to recognize myself in the mirror, I probably am self aware. But still, this is also a point. But look at this other point. The author says other species which are not able to have MSR, the author suggests that they do not have self awareness. So the author is kind of assuming this, right? So if a species does not have mirror self recognition, does it automatically imply that it does not have the capacity of self awareness? Does it not have the capacity to be self aware? This is something that seems like the author is assuming, and it looks like all of you have got it right. Choice B is the correct answer. I'm so happy so many of you got it. um, think about it. If an animal can have a capacity for self awareness, even if it does not have MSR, I like to take the example of cats, because you're talking about non human species, right? So let's say a cat is not able to exhibit mirror self recognition. So essentially, when the cat is looking at the mirror, it's not recognizing itself, but it might still have a fantastic capacity for self awareness. That's essentially what choice B is trying to say. Choice B negated choice B is trying to say, if an animal can have capacity for self awareness, even if it does not have mirror self recognition, then is it logical to make this conclusion? Because the conclusion says that it is unique among non-human species. So what is exactly happening? The study seems to suggest that great apes have MSR, and therefore they have capacity for self awareness. Other animals don't have MSR, and therefore they don't have capacity for self awareness. This is what the argument is trying to push. Choice B puts a bullet hole through this. If it is true that I may not have mirror self recognition, but I'm still self aware, me being the cat, then this conclusion is not logical anymore. I cannot make this anymore, right? I will not be able to say that it's only great apes who have this capacity for self awareness. It's not unique, right? It's not unique anymore. So good. I see that a lot of you have got this. But what I wanted to bring in was this idea that sometimes when it seems a little complex, just abstract it to the letters and see if you can see what should form the missing link. So here there is this link between mirror self-recognition and capacity for self-awareness. The conclusion suddenly brings in this term out of nowhere, right? There must be some linkage there. Once you start thinking on those lines, some of these answer choices will feel a little easier, right? So I don't see any other choice presented by any of you. So I will move on. The choices are there. You can also reach out to me if necessary. So we've kind of discussed this. Um, yeah. Now, there's another aspect, there's another very common, fairly common pattern that I want to discuss, which is about I finding the hidden variables as necessary and slightly mathematical stuff. So why don't you try this question? It's again one of those very classic official questions. Let me know what your answer is. All right, I see answers coming in. Please let me know what other answers are here. So there's D, C, and a couple of E's. Any other answers? Here we go. There's a B. All right. Great job, guys. Let's discuss. So here is where I want to introduce another sometimes seen pattern. It's kind of once in a while you'll see this also. I like to call it the hidden variable. Think about what I've presented here, and then we'll go back to the other question. Company X will increase the selling price of its product by 10% next month. Okay, my selling price is going to increase by 10%, right? And look at the claim that's being made. So the revenue from sales of the product will also increase by 10% as a result. So If this is your argument, think about what's happening here. Am I assuming something here? The way I'd like to think about it is I'm making a conclusion about revenue based on selling price. So, in my mind, I must be assuming some relationship between these two things, right? What is that relationship? Let's start with that. It's our job to be able to figure out what relationship is being hinted at in some of these questions. Exactly. So that is what I like to call the hidden variable. So revenue is equal to selling price into number of units sold, right? So now understand what this argument is. The author claims that, hey, if I'm going to increase my selling price by 10%. So therefore, I should see a 10% increase in my revenue. The question is, what is the logical bullet hole in this argument? What will shatter this argument? The cost is increasing by 10%. That's given, Faith. Something else, the quantity is uh, constant, right? I'm kind of assuming that if my sales price is gonna, and let's take an example. That way it's very clear, right? The idea is, let's say originally 10 units are sold at 10 rupees or $10. So initially the revenue is 100. Now, if I'm going to increase the selling price from 10 to 15, you know, so 5% increase there, 50% increase there, 50% increase there, I should see a equivalent increase here, right? All things being the same, if nothing else changes, my revenue should also be 150, right? When is my revenue not going to increase by this 50%? If my selling price changes. What if my selling price reduces? Then I'm not going to get that 50%, right? So even though what is given in the argument, the premise is about selling price, the conclusion is about revenue, there is a hidden variable here, which is number of units sold. It is our job to figure out this relationship, because sometimes this is where your assumption lies. Clearly, the author is assuming that my number of units sold is not going to change, right? That's actually what's happening in this question. Again, I told you earlier, CR rewards attention to detail. If you did not notice this cents per mile, you might have chosen the wrong answer for this question, right? End of the day, what is given to me is that the toll rate is currently 10 cents per mile. I'm just writing dollar simplicity. It's going to increase by 50%. So it's going to become $15 per mile. Now, just based on the fact that this toll rate is increasing by 50%, the author is arriving at this conclusion that the annual revenue is gonna increase by 50% or more, right? Again, clearly the author is assuming some relationship here. There's some relationship that's happening here. What is that hidden variable? Average revenue is toll rate into what is the question. Look at the unit. Dollars per mile into what would give you dollars? Number of miles, right? So the hidden variable here is, what is the total number of miles that are covered on this highway? That's the one thing that matters. To give a simple numerical example here, if the toll rate was 10 and the total miles covered was 100, we would see a revenue of $1,000. Now, if given the 50% increase in toll rate, if the toll rate stayed at 100, you would expect an equivalent 15%, the 50% increase, which is what the conclusion is talking about. When is that not going to happen? If for some reason the total number of miles reduces from its current level. Instead of 100, if it became 80, then you're not going to see a 50% increase. So the author is actually assuming that the total number of miles covered in this highway, the total distance that has been traversed on this highway in this year, in a calendar year, it's not going to reduce from its current level. So hidden variable, the logic gap was exactly this. What if the annual total miles traveled on the highway, it kind of reduces from its current number, which is why all of you who chose choice E, you guys are right. And notice sometimes the correct answer is hidden and there are trap choices that are given earlier. So all of you who did not choose E, do you see why E is right at this point? Look at what choice E says. The total distance traveled by vehicles will not decrease from its current level. This makes perfect sense because if you negate it, you'll see that it is a necessary condition. Why? If the total distance does reduce from its current level, then there's no way you're going to see a 50% increase, 50% or more increase. There could still be an increase, but it's going to be less than 50%. That's what we saw, right? Everyone with me on this? So some of you chose choice C, B, and D. So let's quickly discuss all of that. B and C are basically cousin, brother, and sister. It's one and the same conceptually. So again, remember, assumption is a necessary condition. You have to ask the question, is choice B necessarily true? Does this have to be true? Or in other words, if you negate choice B, does the conclusion shatter or can it still hold true? Right? And when you think about that, negating choice B, even if the number of trips actually reduces from its current level, what if on average people cover more distance per trip? So even if the number of trips reduces, number of trips per year, the number of trips per year reduces from its current level, what if that gets compensated by more average distance per trip, such that the total distance covered in the year is still pretty much in the same categories, is still pretty much the same, right? So think about it logically. You could do it mathematically, but think about it logically. Okay. Number of trips is coming down. But what if people are covering more distance per trip, such that the total distance that has been traversed on that highway kind of stays the same? Then my conclusion is still going to hold true, right? So my negated choice B is not really breaking my conclusion, right? That's why choice B is wrong. And it's pretty much the same reason why choice C is wrong. Like I told you, it's the cousin brother. If the average length is nothing but average distance covered in a trip. So if the average distance, for some reason, it reduces from its current level, what if people on average do more number of trips? It is compensated by more number of trips on the highway, such that the total distance remains the same. And as we realize, the only variable that matters for this particular argument is the total distance. The toll rate is increasing by 50%. It is the total distance that matters. So even if my average, if people are covering more distance on average, what if number of trips reduces such that pretty much the same number of miles are covered on the highway? That's why C is wrong. D is also very, fairly easy to reject at this point. It's telling you the number of drivers who avoid the highway tolls will not increase. Actually, think about it. What you care about is how many people are going on this highway, what distance is covered on the highway. That is relevant to you. Isn't this out of scope? Let the number of people who go on that, who avoid the highway, let it be 100, let it be 10,000, let it be 1 lakh. Why do you care? Right? Number of drivers who are avoiding the highway, let it increase from its current level. That tells you nothing about the number of people using the highway. It tells you nothing about what distance is being covered on the highway. So do you see why it's actually irrelevant? Yeah, Sagnik, that's actually what I'm trying to drive. This a lot of us have this misconception that not every detail matters. In CR, you don't know which detail matters going in. Some nitty gritty micro detail your brain skipped might be important come answer choice time, right? So read CR much more very intensely is kind of what I really want to emphasize. You have to notice cents per mile. That's key to solving this question, right? And then, of course, very good discipline in processing your choices. Is it really necessary? I'm being very brutal with that analysis. Is choice B really necessary? By the way, choice B and choice C are beautiful strengtheners. And given that every assumption is also a strengthener, that's why it feels like the correct answer. So some of these choices, if you go by vibes, it feels correct. But if you go by precision, it's not right because it's not satisfying that necessary condition, right? So I hope this helped. It gave you an insight into how to solve a lot of these questions. My point here is sometimes these hidden variables matter, right? Um, Another thing, I'm not putting a question. I mean, I'm giving these questions as homework, but you also want to pay attention to some of your numbers versus proportions percentage concepts, right? Think about this for a second, because there are question types that kind of play on this, right? Just because the absolute number x increases does not mean the proportion x by t increases, right? What if t also increases is a scenario you should consider. 10 became 20, but 10 by 1 became 20 by 2, the proportion is the same, right? So sometimes we fail to consider the impact of, let's say, the denominator also increasing, right? Similarly, if I know that the proportion of something is increased, so a 10% of something which was 10% became a 20%, it does not mean that the numerator, let's say x, increased, right? It could be that the denominator decreased. So uh, some of these are sometimes tested, and therefore I just thought I'd make you familiar with it. Some of the answer choices that you see are proportions that are completely irrelevant. The next couple of questions are just homework, and I intended it as homework, but here this is a question where if you are very careful, you will be able to find not just one, several hidden variables. Let me know if you find them, right? This question is, you will see a lot of numbers. There are choices which talk about number of school nurses. There are choices which talk about proportions. Some are relevant, some are not relevant. So it's a good exercise in trying to figure out, what works, what doesn't work, right? So let me just check the comments. Also, we do not know, can't be sure that those drivers, even if they bypass. My point is they are taking the bypass. So earlier that number could be 100, suddenly that number became 1000, or that number became 50. It tells me nothing about the revenue from the highway, because these people are anyway not taking the highway. That's my point, right? So my point here, Sagnik, was that if I look at a choice like choice B, it feels right. Why? Because it actually makes you believe more in the conclusion. If it is true that the total number of trips will not decrease, think about it. So my conclusion is I'm going to increase my toll rate by 50%. My revenue is also going to increase by 50%. If the number of trips does not reduce, it makes me believe more. Okay, there's no reduction in number of trips, so same number of trips are happening. Therefore, all things considered, toll rate is increased by 50%. I should see revenue also increase by 50%. It feels right. The vibe is right, but it's not precise. It's not necessarily true. That's what I'm gunning for. That's what I'm trying to talk about. Right. So I think I'm done. We could do one more question. Let's do this one question. This one is on the one of the lovely questions I've seen. This is a 705 level question. And let's kind of wrap up with this. The last question, I'll leave it as homework. Or we could do this. You guys can let me know if you want, if you're up for another one. Nice. Quite a few D's here. Any other choices? Just checking. So if you have chosen D, that also means you probably rejected A. Can someone tell me how you rejected A? Because A is, I think, one of the other interesting choices here, which a lot of people might choose. All right, we got a B as well. Mhm. Meanwhile, Fanindra, B I think can be rejected easily, and here's why. Again, remember that process. You really have to focus on that conclusion. What is a conclusion exactly in this question? In this particular question, what is a conclusion? The tetracycline in the food, of those ancient Nubians, it explains the low incidence of typhus among the ancient Nubians, right? So the food that they ate, the claim being made is tetracycline was there in their food, and it was this tetracycline in the food that they ate that probably explains the low incidence of typhus among ancient. Now, the conclusion is about tetracycline being the reason for the low incidence of this particular disease called typhus. Do we really care about other than typhus, other those other diseases? The diseases other than typhus to which ancient Nubians were exposed would not be affected by tetracycline. Why do we care? Maybe those other diseases could also be impacted or affected by tetracycline, maybe not. The point is, we are talking only about typhus. So the question is, the argument, the conclusion is, as far as typhus is concerned, the tetracycline in the food explains why there was a low incidence of typhus amongst those ancient Nubians. So tetracycline impacting other diseases should not really be relevant, right? B, I think, is a fairly easy choice to reject. So A is like a trap choice which a lot of people falter on. The reason this question goes into that difficult category, if I go by GMAT Club's categorization, is because around 35% of people kind of choose choice A. So it's a very popular answer choice. Why is it not necessary? Again, really visualize the scenario. Imagine you are that ancient Nubian, right? The tetracycline deposits did not form after the bodies were buried. This does not have to be true at all. It's not necessary. Even if this is not true, the tetracycline deposits actually formed only after the bodies were buried. Great. That is tetracycline deposits. Maybe tetracycline was swimming in the blood of the Nubians while they were alive, and the fact that tetracycline was in their body, it really explains the low incidence of typhus amongst ancient Nubians. So the fact that the point that tetracycline deposits did not form after the bodies were buried should not matter. It's not necessary. So for anyone, I mean, it's like this choice has like 35% or 33% people going for it. So I thought it should be discussed for that reason. Choice D is absolutely right. And again, choice A looks very nice, but this may not feel nice, but you have to have the discipline of seeing if it is really necessary. And once you display the discipline, you'll see the dividends. This is not supposed to be an easy question, but it is. Tetracycline is not rendered ineffective as an antibiotic by exposure to the process involved in making the bread and beer. Bread and beer are their staples. It's two of the staples of the diet. Uh, the entire idea here was that the bacterium that produces tetracycline, it kind of flourishes on the grain that is used to make the bread and the beer. The idea was that therefore this food must be containing all this tetracycline, and it is causing all this low incidence of typhus, right? But if I go against choice D and negate it, that means that tetracycline is basically rendered ineffective as an antibiotic by the process involved in making bread and beer. In other words, The food that the Nubians consumed, it might contain tetracycline, but it is ineffective as an antibiotic. Then how can you still conclude that the tetracycline is the reason for the low incidence of typhus? Doesn't make any sense, right? Which is why choice D is the right answer. The negated choice D breaks the conclusion. So I think one of the things that I really want you to see is, in a lot of these cases, if you want to really process the tough choices, you have to be ready to negate. You have to be, because negation is not just a test, it's you testing for whether a choice is actually necessary. And necessary is the fundamental definition of an assumption. There's no escaping this. So you have to work on it, right? So this is a great question. You guys tell me, do you want to do this now, or shall we, wrap up and call it today? I'll just wait for a 10-15 seconds and then we'll decide. Otherwise, I'll just wrap up. No biggie. Okay, we got two for doing it. So let's do this question. Let's wrap up with this one. Again, it's a fantastic question. Let's have some fun with it. So we have an E, we have an A. We have a D, we have one more A, couple of A's in fact. Okay. A is like the more popular choice here. And excellent. So let's start discussing this. So this one on the difficulty scale is right up there. Of course, the passage itself is fairly easy to comprehend. Even if the word molt is unfamiliar, it seems to be something similar to shedding. You can kind of infer. Every time the rattlesnake does something called molting, a new section is formed. Whatever that is. But it seems to be some kind of shedding of the skin or something, right? So the argument itself is easy to comprehend, but the reason this question is really awesome is it again really pushes you on your ability to see what is absolutely necessary. So notice the phrasing of the question. Which one of the following is an assumption the argument requires in order for its conclusion to be properly drawn? You asked for something that's absolutely must. So all of you who told me A is the right choice, you're in for a bit of a shock. A is not the right choice. A is the most popular choice. It's like, as far as this question is concerned, it's like 30%, and there's another 20%, there's another 30%. So, uh, Vandita, you were right. E was right all along. But why is A not necessary? First, let's make sure the conclusion is clear. This again is firstly, let's focus on the conclusion because there's something happening there. If the rattles were not so brittle, one could reliably determine the age of a rattlesnake simply from the number of sections in its rattle. So first let's understand the story. So this folktale that claims that a rattlesnake's age can be determined from the number of sections in its rattle, it is false, but only because the rattles are brittle and sometimes, partially or completely break off. So what the author is trying to tell you from that first sentence is, hey, the problem is that the rattle is brittle. The only reason that folktale is false. The only reason that a rattlesnake's age you are not able to determine it from the number of sections in the rattle. It's because the rattles are brittle and they break off. You cannot rely on this. But the author is presenting you with a very hypothetical conclusion. So whenever you see this if in your conclusion statement, that means you're looking at a hypothetical. We know that it's actually brittle, but consider that scenario where the rattle was not so brittle. If those rattles were not so brittle, one could reliably determine the age of the rattlesnake just by observing the number of sections in its rattle. How does the author justify this stand? This justification is each new section is formed each time a rattlesnake molts. So number of sections in its rattle. So if you're talking about a rattlesnake. So I'm very bad at drawing. So let's say these are the rattles of the snake. This is the tail. And let's say these are all the rattles. Every time the rattlesnake molts, a new rattle is created. Based on this, the author goes on to say that consider that scenario where the rattles were not so brittle. So if the rattles were not so brittle, then you could reliably figure out the age of the rattlesnake. Great. So if I think about it, it must be that there is some connection between the rattlesnake molting and the age, right? So it's like maybe every year it molts, every 6 months it molts. There has to be some regularity in terms of timeline with which it molts so that you could figure out the age. Now, for all of you who chose choice A, the only reason choice A is not right is yet again my entire summary of this entire session. It's not necessary, right? I'll give you the easy scenario, simple scenario. What if molting happens in a rattlesnake every 6 months? So, in other words, every 6 month molting happens. So, if you observe 24, or let's say if you observe 26 sections in the rattle, that means the age should be 13, right? In other words, you can, even if choice A is not true, even if rattlesnakes do not molt exactly once a year, as long as that pattern is still regular, maybe they molt every 6 months, maybe they molt every 2 years. In any of those cases, you'll be able to determine the age, given that the in the condition that the rattles were not brittle. You should still be able to determine the age, which is why this molting exactly a year is not necessary at all. For everyone who chose choice A, which is the majority of us, is this clear? Just let me know. Consider the scenario. And really, being able to solve a lot of these tough questions is about visualizing such scenarios, right? What if I could molt every, I mean, the snake could molt every 6 months? It's as simple as that. I should still be able to do it, right? Great. I'm happy that's clear. Just give me one sec. Yeah. So let's talk about the other choices that were somewhat popular. I saw D and I saw E. Now D is very interesting, but here's the easy way to reject D. The brittleness should not matter in this argument. You know why? Because if you look at the conclusion of the argument, I've already said, boss, forget about brittleness. If this brittleness is not a factor, I'll be able to determine the age of the snake just by looking at number of sections. So how this brittleness correlates with length doesn't matter, right? It may be that as the snake ages, as the snake's age increases, the rattle becomes more brittle. Great, let there be some correlation. Doesn't matter. This conclusion is, if brittleness was not a problem, if the rattles were not really so brittle, I would be able to determine the age. So choice D is very cleverly irrelevant. The argument is concerned only with the scenario where brittleness is not really a problem. It's not an issue. It's kind of factored out of this conclusion, right? So considering brittleness to not be an issue, age can be determined. That's my conclusion. I don't need to assume anything about how brittleness correlates with length or anything. Is that clear? I hope. Now, why is choice A right? Now, choice A, again, honestly, it gives all the vibes of a wrong answer. Where is food coming in? Is what you'll ask me. Right, we're talking about molting, which seems to be some kind of shedding. We're talking about finding the age of the rattlesnake. Where the hell is food coming in all of this, right? Because it's talking about food. But again, what is this choice trying to say? What happens if you are rigorous in applying the necessary test? Is it necessary test? Rattlesnakes molt as often when food is scarce. This is supposed to be food is scarce, as they do when food is plentiful, right? So what happens if this is not true? If this is not true, in essence, you're telling me that rattlesnakes molt differently when food is scarce compared to when food is plentiful. You know what that does? That means molting kind of becomes a function of food availability also. It's not just something that every 3 months or every 1 year the snake is going to molt. It kind of becomes subject to food availability. Then knowing that there is this other factor called food availability impacting molting, how can I just happily conclude that just because I know the number of sections and sections get formed every time molting happens, how will I be able to determine the age? If depending on, and think about the real life scenario, you don't know when all you cannot always predict when food is available, when food is scarce, right? Depends. So if this is not true, molting is not just something that's related to the age. It Food availability becomes an impacting factor, right? Therefore, how can I use molting to determine age? It doesn't make sense, right? So I hope this is clear. Negation of choice C, where rattlesnakes molt as often when food is scarce as they do when food is plentiful. Essentially, the core idea of choice C is that as far as rattlesnakes are concerned, molting happens with the same frequency whether food is available or whether food is scarce. Even whether food is available or whether food is scarce doesn't matter. Molting happens with a regular frequency. That's what choice C is trying to say. So the negation of choice C is, depending on whether food is scarce or whether food is plentiful, the molting frequency can change. So, for example, molting might happen a lot more when food is available. Molting might not happen as much when food is not available. That's essentially negated choice C, right? Is that clear? That's the exact negation of choice C. And again, I'm focusing on the core idea rather than anything grammatical here. Cool. That's great. I hope we had a good discussion here. Again, for me, a lot of those patterns, I don't want you to mug up any of it. That's not the point. The objective was just to build a little bit of familiarity. For instance, when you're reviewing the work that you do, when you're solving after the session, when you're solving assumptions, when you're solving critical reasoning assumption questions, and when you're doing your review, or otherwise what some of you like to call error logging, your brain might pay attention to some of these patterns. So you will see that, okay, this was a causal argument where the correct assumption was essentially tried to say that the reverse causality was not true. So it is not the case that y caused x. Okay, you've seen it in a question, your brain recognizes the pattern. Even in the exam, you might recognize it. The important caveat there is, don't over rely on patterns. That's not the point. Don't mug up any of this. That's not the point. It's just familiarity, nothing else. But a lot of important things that we discussed today, especially in the first half, the theory of assumptions. What are arguments? I hope is clear. The premises, the conclusions, I hope they are clear. GMAT arguments, I hope clear. The necessary condition, if there's one thing you take away from the session, I hope it is this necessary condition of assumptions and therefore the negation test, right? Also, the specific framework to solve questions, be systematic with it. Read the question, read the passage first, read the argument or passage first, go to the question stem, figure out what it is there, what you're being asked to do. Don't directly jump to the choices. If nothing else, make sure that you spend a few seconds ensuring that the conclusion is crystal clear. In really tough questions where you feel that, oh, I may not have understood the logic well, spend some time on figuring out the justification, or you could call it the evidence used to justify the conclusion. I don't care for the terminology. The point is, make sure you're crystal clear on what is the conclusion, what is the justification used to arrive at this conclusion. Because if you have done that well, the problem is framed in your brain correctly. That's half the battle. The rest is analysis or answer choice analysis, etc. So, where possible, try to think about, what are the critical issues in the argument, where are the logical gaps, especially when you're solving untimed. Push this muscle, because the more you push this muscle, the more it comes automatically. In the exam, you only have time to do this automatically, right? And in any case, if nothing clicks, go to the choices. The answer choices is always the business end. It's the most important part. I'm very clear about that. Uh, Another thing I hope I've convinced you today is, don't shy away from negating choices and seeing if it is necessary. For me, it is actually the most critical test of an assumption. An assumption has to bring in new information. An assumption has to be necessarily true for the argument to hold. If it's not true, the argument should break down. So you have to be always ready to negate, right? Now, I did notice that with some of the really complex negations, we did struggle. So feedback for all of us in that case is, perhaps we need to work on negation as a skill. Negation is also a skill. So you could create complex sentences of your own, and the challenge is to try to identify the logical negation of it, right? Good exercise, you will benefit a lot from that. Okay. So of course, some other themes like this hidden variable, all of that is good. Some good principles I want you to remember. Again, in all of these answer choice analysis that you saw me do, you saw me obsess over clarity on conclusion. So many of those answer choices which seem tricky initially, once you're very clear about what the conclusion is, they're easy to reject. So a choice which said, like choice B, right? The argument is very specific about tetracycline being able to explain the low incidence of typhus. So whether tetracycline is able to impact other diseases, not relevant. It's that clarity on conclusion that will help you reject some of these answer choices. So, which is why even in my process, I have the checkpoint clarity on conclusion, but it should be hammered into your head at the point of answer choice analysis. Um, I've shown you specific examples where this attention to detail matters. So if you did not notice the for the next year, you wouldn't know why fully abides doesn't work, right? If you did not notice cents per mile, then you will not be able to see why choice E works in the highway commission question. So CR rewards attention to detail. Make sure you do that, right? So the key to doing that is reading carefully. You have to pause after your sentences, allow your brain the chance to catch all those details, right? Um, we also discussed a few really tough choices where the key is to actually put yourself in those shoes and picturize the scenario. So when I was talking about downtown traffic congestion, imagine I'm that person who has to go to the downtown. What if I cause a lot of traffic congestion on the way to downtown, and then I don't cause any congestion once I'm inside downtown? Once you're able to really put yourself there and picturize a scenario, some of this answer choice analysis can also happen a little easier, in an easier way, right? So I hope that helps. That's it from my side. I'm done. I'm going to stop sharing. Let's get rid of the screen. Let me know any general thoughts. Thanks for that, Juan, Sid, Savnik. I do provide coaching. Just check me out, yeah. Um, I think the YouTube description of this video has my details if you want to get in touch with me. But any other general points? What would you like me to cover next? I do have a couple more sessions coming up. It's a little later. I think not this month. I don't remember the exact date, but it's coming soon. But any other specific question types that you want me to touch, feel free to let me know. Sid, that's a lot. That's very kind words. Yeah, I feel I can do this session all night. Uh, I, if any of my students here, you guys know I do take very long sessions, so I have the potential to fry your brain for like 4 5 hours at least. But yeah, good. I'm happy you got some benefit from it. Evaluate. All right, evaluate. I've taken that into account. Thanks, Juan. And thanks, Sid, for the lovely feedback as well. Any way to make sure 100% accuracy? Making sure, I know it's doable. Of course, it's doable. In the verbal section, I'm very sure it is doable. A lot of us have done it also. But it requires, firstly, you need absolute clarity on concepts. But concepts is like the easier part of it. Beyond concepts, you need to build a lot of muscle in solving questions. You need to first solve untimed. Don't jump into timed sets. Usually, that's not a great thing, because a lot of your solving ability gets built untimed, and then as you start solving in time scenarios, your brain adapts to it. Now you have to go difficulty wise and make sure you're hitting good accuracy benchmarks for each and every difficulty level. Um, Eventually, at one point, what will happen is you're really comfortable. It's only about improving your efficiency, building intuition. So verbal, I think all of you guys realize, compared to the classic edition, it's a little more tight now in the focus edition. Earlier you used to have, let's say, around 2 minutes. Now you have 1.9 minutes. So I personally believe that either CR or RC, one of those two sections, you should be a little faster. So for instance, I am a little faster with my RC. I usually do fly through RC a little bit. You know, therefore I tend to save a little bit of time on RC, and therefore I'm happy to spend a few more seconds on CR if necessary. So somewhere one of those sections, I believe you have to be able to go a little faster. I'm not saying you have to solve it in 1 minute, but if CR is going to take you 2.1 minutes on average, then let RC take you 1.85 minutes on average, right? So you need that adjustment somewhere. Uh, but the science behind reducing time is 90% is a function of solving ability. So to be able to solve in time scenarios, first you have to build the ability to solve untimed. Untimed solving, where you're not just solving, quality over quantity. If you solve, sit and review, because it's when you review that your brain sees what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, and then you can take corrective actions. Now, an example of that is if you notice that you are reading the choice a little too fast, you're rushing through the answer choices, and that is what is creating a problem. Then you know that you need to do something there. What can you do? You probably need to put in a pause after you read the choice, just as a disciplinary measure to ensure that you're not rushing. Or you need to take a 1 second deep breath before you go into an answer choice. just to ground yourself and remind yourself that you should read the choice well. This might sound silly, but these are the kind of things that actually, these are kind of tweaks that actually work. But point is, first build ability on time. You should see ability to do under time also get under control. Then it's about building efficiency in specific areas. For instance, in RC, I would audit my time and figure out which sentences I'm taking too much time, which sentences I'm not taking. I'm probably able to fly past through, and I'll kind of see which kind of sentences I can usually go fast in. So your brain will start seeing patterns of where you can go fast, where you can go slow. Not every sentence on the exam you're going to read at the same speed. There are places where you can go fast, there are places where you can go slow. That judgment comes from review, right? So yeah, Rishika, to answer the question, 100% accuracy is very, very possible. We've all seen it, done it. It's been done. Um, Sign, is it possible to build that muscle in a span of 6 weeks? Uh, 6 weeks definitely is a good enough time to build a lot of muscle. I don't know about 100%, but definitely you should, even three and a half weeks of focused effort, right? You should see a lot of benefit. I think I think a lot of people have this idea that you have to keep solving thousands of questions and it's gonna take 6 7 months. For some people, it does take 6 7 months. It does take years also, but not everyone. That's not always the case. Some of these things it should happen in weeks rather than months. So I believe it is possible for most of us, right? Great questions, yeah. So Sagnik told me evaluate. Any other question types in mind? I'm just taking the general view. V79 to V85. I'm sure you have seen the percentile conversion table. V79 to V85 is a very steep jump. Though it looks like it's only 6 points. Those 6 points, right? It's gonna take a lot to get those 6 points. So, um, how much time can it take? It's a very tough question to answer. Really varies person to person being able to commit. So, I'm not able to give you a proper answer to that. But it can take some time, especially that stretch is not easy. The early stretch, right? If you are sitting at V50 or V60, getting to V80 may not be that difficult. Learn the concepts, practice a little bit, it'll come in. This stage is a little trickier. Every point of improvement takes a lot. So still, maybe 1 month, maybe 1.5 months. But again, I'm very skeptical of giving an exact time. It really varies a lot individually. So pinch of salt. Um, I read somewhere that it's better to get Wall Street Journal subscription to improve reading speed. Do you recommend that? Uh, I have no problems with getting a Wall Street Journal subscription. It is one of the legit reading sources out there. I think the language is very similar to what you can expect on the GMAT. So, getting that subscription is perfectly fine. Not really necessarily for the purpose of improving reading speed. Um, of course, there is a certain level of speed with which we have to read, but most of the time, what I see is people are reading too fast. You have to slow down first. First, you have to slow down, and once you really build a certain level of muscle, then very slightly speed up. So, usually when people say I want to improve my reading speed, I'm always a little skeptical about that because most of the slips in verbal happen because we are reading too fast, right? I remember a couple of years ago, I worked with a student. The only issue that we saw, his accuracy in RC was not great. Very smart guy. The only issue that I saw is he's actually reading the passage too fast. So a passage where he should be spending 2.5, 3 minutes, he's reading through in 1.5 minutes, and, and therefore he's making all sorts of mistakes in the questions. So the only fix that we did was you have to make sure that you're reading at least for 2.5, 3 minutes, whatever the passage. That actually fix things. So sometimes his reading speed is a very tricky slope, right? We all need a certain level of reading speed, but it's GMAT, it's not really a test of reading speed per se. Yeah. Inference based questions is where I usually make mistakes. If it is CR, my CR session from 2 weeks ago may help, but reach out to me. Perhaps I can help with some of that. Yeah. Inference, some of those questions are tricky, but nothing that's not achievable. I'm very sure about that. All right. Any further questions? Yeah, but to kind of finish that point, so the Wall Street Journal, go for it. Nothing wrong. Wall Street, Economist, they're all reasonably good sources as far as the style of language is concerned. Um, as you're reading those articles, here is what one of the things that I would like you to do. Don't just read with this intent that you have to explain the crux of it to somebody. So as you read every paragraph, try to summarize the crux of what you read in the paragraph. Once you've read the article, in your mind, try to summarize the crux of it. Imagine you have to explain it, the core ideas of it to someone. Do that. So just reading for the sake of reading will not cut it. Read with that intent where you know you're going to be tested on it. You need to understand the core ideas. That has a lot of value, right? But yeah, go right ahead. Thanks for that, Bhavya. Good to see you here. So, Ritik, one of the things is a mock is an individual data point. It's a singular data point. You have a bad day, despite all your preparation, you might have a bad score. Your day wasn't great. So more than an individual mock giving you a bad score, that's okay. Overall, with the time sets that you're doing, with all the practice that you're doing, if you're hitting those benchmarks, if you're getting reasonably good accuracy under timed conditions, you're good. It's okay if on a particular mock you went, but maybe the next mock should go better, right? Um, with RC, remember it's a lot of uh, big picture. Everything you're reading, you're trying to figure out what the author is really trying to say, what the author is trying to do. So if you're able to stay on top of that and not get overly buried in the details, you should be good. Assumption, hopefully this helps. Practice, let me know if you struggle somewhere. I should be able to help. Thanks, Rishika, for that feedback. What are the questions with the maximum weightage on the verbal section? So, on the exam, there's no guarantee what you'll get. So, of course, statistically, we know that questions like weekend are kind of popular. Uh, I do expect a couple of your fill in the blanks also these days. You can expect one bold face. So, you might get in on any particular day, you might get something very weird, very different. Uh, Statistically, I believe weekend is one of the more popular data types, question types that come up in CR at least. With RC, it's a mixed bag. You can expect anything under the sun. But expect a couple of long passages. I think ever since the focus edition came in, we are seeing a couple of long passages, longer than the usual. So be ready for that as well. If you were to tell me one question type or section without which a decent score is not achievable, to be fair, the GMAT is fairly balanced, right? So even if your quant or verbal is not good, maybe your DI will pull you through. But if you want to for a great score, you need to be really, really good at least two, and reasonably good at the third. So uh, yeah, RC is not really my forte, especially with a dense single paragraph. All right. So that I think that needs a bit of work in terms of how to. I think one of my sessions upcoming would be on RC. I don't know, it might be a little late for you, but some of my earlier RC sessions are there. If you search on YouTube, if you search on the YouTube's on GMAT Club's channel, I used to do quite a few sessions a couple of years ago. My RC sessions might help. I think my session on keywords, RC keywords, it it does help you unpack some of those dense passages. Maybe you'll find something useful there, right? Should we practice LSAT RC? I'm a big fan of LSAT RC. I think every tutor will recommend LSAT wholeheartedly. Uh, Very slight stylistic differences are there. The harder LSATs are tougher than what you see on the GMAT, but uh, excellent for practice, excellent for building all the right muscles of reading comprehension. Uh, I'm a big fan. I go crazy with LSAT, right? So especially in the early phases, towards the end of your prep, you want to focus more on GMAT, bring it back to the official stuff. But while you're practicing on time, building muscle, go crazy, go for LSAT. A lot of great passages there, and you'll find a lot on GMAT clubs. So big fan. All right. It does look like we are done. I don't see any further questions coming in. So thanks a lot, everyone, for being with me for the last 2.5, 3 hours. So, yeah, most of the CR question types are also very similar. In fact, the last question that we just solved, the rattlesnake question, I believe is LSAT more than anything else. That was a very, very good question, yes, assumptions. So it's perfect. Yeah. Philosophy and history. That takes a little getting used to. Honestly, the GMAT is meant to be topic agnostic, and I really believe it's topic agnostic. I come from an engineering background. At this point, I don't care if it's philosophy or something else. Those things don't matter now. That said, yeah, some of those philosophy, history, social science related passages are written in a slightly, convoluted way. So it takes some getting used to. Again, the real muscle to push is with everything you read, what are the implied ideas the author wants you to understand? What is the author really trying to say? What is the author really trying to prove? You have to really hammer in and ask those questions as you're reading the sentences. It becomes very important to pause after sentences to think about what the author is trying to do. Now, that is a muscle. It's easy to say. You have to practice that with a very deliberate way till it becomes very intuitive and automatic. Right? So, yeah, I hope that gives you some clarity. But yeah, check my earlier sessions. It might help on RC. And I do have something upcoming with RC pretty soon, hopefully. Right, yeah. That is it. I think this is a good time to wrap up. Thanks a lot. I hope you guys learned something useful. See you on the next session.